Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Oakland Aviation Museum. Today is September 12th, 2021, and I'm your docent, Dan. And today we are having a very special event here called Open Cockpit Day, where, as you can see behind me, we have a very rare event, maybe 4 times a year here at the museum, where we're able to open up the cockpits to a lot of these very historic aircraft here at the Oakland Aviation Museum. And we'll be able to go around and actually look inside the cockpits and hear a lot of their stories. And I'll be guiding you into some of the histories behind these aircraft. And it's my pleasure to do this today. Thank you for joining us on this beautiful sunny day. This aircraft is the A6 Intruder. This is actually converted into a fueling tanker. It was originally a Navy carrier-based all-weather day or night attack aircraft that could carry, I think, about 16,000 pounds of ordnance. And it could fly at any time of the day and night in any weather, and had this amazing ground mapping and weather and targeting radar in the nose, which is why the nose is so big. And it could carry ordnance on target very quickly, flying alone below the radar, hopefully, of any enemy, and then drop its package and then turn and then fly back out to the aircraft carrier and then land. And these flew from 1963 until about 1996. You may recognize these from a movie called The Flight of the Intruder, starring Daniel Glover and Willem Dafoe. It was a great movie because it actually showed actual aircraft, A6s in flight. And like I said, this was converted later on into a KA6D. The K stands for kerosene because it would carry fuel. And the fuel that it would carry would be in these external tanks here. And then it would pump through a hose that came out the back. And there was a basket that would dangle from the end of this hose that would drain out. And then the other aircraft with their fuel probes. You can see one on the aircraft on the back there, but all these modern carrier-based aircraft have fuel probes. You can see there on the A7, you can actually see that it's tucked into the side there. So that pops out, and then the pilots fly at 250 knots together at the same speed, and then they insert the fuel probe into this basket, which is again dangling maybe about 50 feet behind the smaller plane here, and then it fuels up. And that's how they extend their range. And this could, of course, then come back and then take on bombs if it had to on the deck of the aircraft carrier. This aircraft had a cruising speed or a top speed of about 650 knots, so it couldn't go supersonic, but it certainly could do the job. And we're going to come up here and take a look into the cockpit. So let's take a look inside the aircraft here. So you see on the left side where the red cushion is, that would be where the pilot would sit. Sits a little bit higher than the bombardier navigator, who would sit on the right side there. He would sit higher because pilots are better than navigators. No, actually, we sit higher simply because the to be able to add visibility. And what the navigator and the bombardier would see they would ordinarily have a huge scope here in front of there that would be tracking the ground and the targets and the weather, and then would be able to give directions or called vectors to the pilot, who would then steer the aircraft based on that information, which he could then transfer to that small screen right in front of the pilot right there. In fact, if we see here, this is what it's like sitting in the cockpit. We still have a lot, because it's an older aircraft, there's no rule glass cockpit here. This is all what we call steam gauges. And then you see all the circuit breakers back there. And what's interesting is at a pilot training, you would actually have to memorize where all these switches were, including the circuit breakers, and be able to find them even blindfolded, because you may be flying at night and have a circuit failure, and you'd have to be able to reach there in complete darkness and see what was up and fix it. This here, you can see these are the Martin Baker ejection seats, and they were very they were the ways to get out of the aircraft in the case of an emergency. And then back here, you see all the mechanism for the canopy to slide forward and back. And so that is a look inside the KA6D also known as the A6 Intruder here at Oakland. So thank you very much. Over here, we have one of my favorite aircraft. You may recognize this from Top Gun. This is the F-14a Tomcat. And this aircraft first flew for the Navy in about 1972 until 2006. It was built to do one thing, and that was to defend the carrier fleet from attack from Soviet bombers. And to do that, there was a missile called the AIM-54 Phoenix missile, which could carry a 200-pound warhead, an active radar-guided warhead that would then track onto the bomber that it was targeted to. And once it would be shot, it would fly up to 80,000 feet and then dive down onto the bombers. And with this radar up in the front here was used to track those targets, and it could track up to 24 targets simultaneously and shoot down 6 of them at once. And it could track those targets more than 100 nautical miles away. And right below it, you'll see that this is a camera. This camera, it has a fairing on it, so you can't really see the lens, but that would be used to verify the target. And in it, you also had, in addition to missiles, you would also have a gun. This gun here is called the M61a Vulcan Gun, and it was a Gatling gun, which it had 6 barrels, and it would fire a 20-millimeter shell. And this is what a 20-millimeter shell looks like. I'm going to pull it out right now. This is a 20-millimeter shell, so you can see how large the shell was. And it would fire these at 100 rounds a second, so 6,000 rounds a minute. It would fire these. This was a swept-wing aircraft. The faster it went, once it passed the speed of sound, the wings would sweep back from 20 degrees up to 68 degrees. And even parked on the deck of the aircraft carrier, these wings could sweep even further back in order to save space on the deck. And this could travel 2.38 times the speed of sound, which is about 26 miles a minute. And the interesting thing about these engines is that they have these ramps that would come down to compress the air, to slow down the airflow at supersonic speeds in order so that the supersonic air wouldn't actually blow the engine out like a candle, which it could do. You see these landing gear here? Well, this nose strut here, if it can compress, the pilot will hit a switch called kneel, and it compresses down to 4 inches from 18 inches. And then this launch bar here, right in the front here, it sticks into this little shuttle that's in a track on the deck of the aircraft carrier. And that's what it holds on to launch it from 0 to 160 knots in 2 seconds. So in the 200-foot long track of the catapult, it's this most amazing ride of their lives. Off an aircraft carrier, this would be required to be in full afterburner. Now, what an afterburner does is it dumps raw fuel into the jet exhaust, and that causes basically a controlled explosion, which causes the jet to go even faster. And that's what enables you to go supersonic. And it takes a lot of fuel, though. For example, this aircraft carried on board about 20,000 pounds of fuel, and it would burn through all 20,000 pounds of fuel in 8 minutes if it were at full afterburner. So you can't fly that fast all the time. You only use it in order to get in your target, get out of your target, take off, and to shoot and scoot. But you wouldn't have a lot of time otherwise. Ordinarily, just on just regular onboard fuel at regular cruise, its range is it's over 2,000 miles, which is about twice as long as the F/A-18 Hornet, which is now replacing it today. So this is a great long range fighter bomber that could be a great defense against the fleet. This tail here, you can see, is huge, this horizontal stabilizer. Each of those stabilizers can move independently. The left and the right one can move up and down separately, and that's how the aircraft turns. This aircraft does not have ailerons. What you see on the end of the wings here are actually 2 separated flaps. So you've got an outboard flap, and then you have an inboard flap. And the inboard flap wouldn't work when the wings are fully swept. So you would also have, you can maybe see up on the top there are 3 spoilers which pop up like this, which also add drag. And between the spoilers and the different angles of the horizontal stabilizer, that's how this aircraft would roll and turn. This here is a tail hook, which is something you'll see on all aircraft that fly on and off an aircraft carrier, because this will drop down and this hook catches onto one of 4 cables that go across the deck of the aircraft carrier. Of course, the pilot is aiming for the 3rd cable, because the first one will stop you, but it stops you a little abruptly, and the last one will stop you, but you may be close to the end of the deck before it slows you down. And once you land on that, you're landing at about 150 miles an hour, and then when you touch down, you actually hit full power just in case the tail hook misses the wire, so that you can take off again if you have to. So if you miss the wire, and sometimes these tail hooks will bounce off the deck, even if you made a perfect approach. And so you have to go around. That's called a bolter. And sometimes at night on a pitching deck in bad weather, it could take pilots 6 or 7 times to land on a carrier. And it's a very, very scary situation every single time. These holes that you see up here underneath the beaver tail here, these would hold anti-missile defenses. They would hold 30 shots. One of these would carry flares, which were very hot to try to distract any enemy heat-seeking missiles. And the other carried chaff, which were strips of aluminum foil to fool radar-guided missiles. So as we go underneath the aircraft here, you can see this is called the tunnel. And 25% of the lift of the F-14 was actually generated by the body of the aircraft, including the tunnel. And you see this little recessed area here. This hole here is where the fin for, I guess, a Sparrow missile would go. A Sparrow missile was an air-to-air missile, medium range. And then it had this trough that was cut into the underside of the aircraft here so that the missile wouldn't cause so much drag. So that is the F-14 Tomcat. This is the A3D. This is the largest type of aircraft in regular service that flew on and off of aircraft carriers. And it was originally designed in the late 40s in order to carry the A-bomb and the H-bomb faster than bombers could reach from land-based airports in the United States. So you would just launch this off a carrier. But in the mid-1960s, they invented the Polaris missile submarine, and they started carrying missiles on submarines. So that was much more efficient. And so they converted this into a KA-3, which is the K stands for kerosene, because that's what jet fuel is. And so if you look up here, instead of bombs, you'll actually see a bladder that was filled with jet fuel. And then this hose would dangle down the back, just like we saw in the K-8, on the KA-60, the Intruder. This hose would trail out the back, and then other aircraft would come up and they would sip fuel and refuel. So this aircraft actually has some history around it, because this plane itself saved perhaps hundreds of lives, because the pilot in 1969 was taking off of an aircraft carrier, and the aircraft suddenly started doing uncontrolled rolls where it would flip upside down. And the bomb navigator in the right seat, they gave the order to bail out, and he ended up jumping out on top of the aircraft. And the pilot realized that he could maintain control of the aircraft because he put full power, thinking that he was going to dive into the ocean just to get it over with. And he realized that at full power, the plane regained control. So he realized he could control it at full power. So he flew full power all the way back to Miramar Air Force Base on a long Marine Corps runway, landed, and the airplanes ran out of fuel. And what happened is that once they inspected the aircraft, they found that there was a bolt the size of your thumb that had broken. And they inspected all Douglas aircraft, and they found 30 other aircraft that had the same aileron actuator cable bolt that it was cracked from a defect. And because they were able to find that crack, they were able to ground and repair those 30 aircraft, including DC-8s, passenger airplanes. So he got the Distinguished Flying Cross for that service, landing aircraft safely. Everybody lived, and this is the airplane itself that's here today. So we're going to step into the cockpit very briefly. We have a long line of people waiting to get in. And so this is a very rare treat. So this, what we're climbing through, is actually the escape tube by which the pilots would have to jump out of the aircraft because there were no ejection seats. Because that they called the A3D the all three dead because it was so risky. Because without ejection seats, you had to you had to slide down the chute or jump out the top hatch like this here. So this, I'm going to quickly pop in here, is the cockpit, so you can see all the instruments. In fact, the president, John Horton, of this museum, flew this specific actual aircraft in service when he was a lieutenant commander in the Navy. All right, so down I come. I'm going to do this one-handed. Excuse me. All right. Great. So thanks, everyone. So let's go take a look at another aircraft. This is the A7 Corsair II. It had a nickname back in the Navy called the Slough, or the short, little, ugly fellow. And this was an attack aircraft. You can see it was a carrier-based plane because the tips of the wing go up. And it's actually in Army colors now. The Greek Air Force flew this specific airplane for a while. And the cheek rails that you see there are for holding Sidewinder missiles, which were, the Sidewinder missiles were for air-to-air combat. The other thing that it had is down here is a Gatling gun, and you can see that is a 6-barrel gun. This is also a 20-millimeter round that would fire, just looking just like this. And so it had some defensive armament as well. You can see this great radar. This is a tracking radar that it had on it. And this aircraft was the first aircraft to have a heads-up display. A heads-up display is similar to if you might be driving a fancy car that has those today, but most fighter aircraft today have heads-up displays. And what that allows you to do is it allows the pilot to look out the windscreen and see the targeting and other information transmitted onto the screen of the windscreen so that he or she can look out the aircraft while flying it and not have to look down at the instruments to check their airspeed and targeting and stuff like that. So this again is pretty much a complete cockpit here. The throttle is on the left side there. So this is the throttle right there. And this was not a supersonic aircraft, but it could go almost the speed of sound. Speed of sound is 666 knots at sea level under normal temperature. And it gets a little bit, the speed of sound is a little bit slower the higher you go. And so this again is an ejection seat that it had the all Navy aircraft have on. So you can see how much workload the pilots had to do. Look how busy that cockpit is. All right, so this is the A7 Corsair II, the Slough. This aircraft here is one of my favorite aircraft too. This is the A4 Skyhawk. This A4 Skyhawk, Heinemann was a designer that was given the task to build an aircraft carrier plane attack bomber that was under 9,000 pounds. So, and he came in at 8,000 pounds. So this is an 8,000-pound fighter jet, very light, very small. In fact, the tail is, the whole wing is as small as the tail horizontal stabilizer of the F-14 Tomcat. So this is a very, very tiny cockpit, as you can see. This is the trainer version. This is the TA4J version of the Skyhawk. And this is what Navy pilots use to train and qualify for carrier landings. Because if you can't land in this with another pilot in the back helping you, then they're not going to let you try to land a one control stick, multi-million dollar, tens of $1 million aircraft like the F-14 Tomcat. So this is what you do all your training in as a pilot. It was also made a great attack bomber because it was very versatile. This had a roll rate of 720 degrees a second. That's 2 full rolls, 360 degrees, 2 full rolls every second. So that's 1 1,002. And you can see how small the cockpit is. And when you made that roll, it was pretty much impossible to not hit your head on the canopy because it's so tight. One of the beautiful things about this aircraft is you can see, because you're so far forward, when you look back, you don't see your own wings. And so you actually feel like you're flying. And this is such a dynamic aircraft that the Blue Angels flew this for 11 years. And this is, to this day, one of their favorite aircraft that they've flown. And so this is the A4 Skyhawk. And this is the 2-person TA4J version. So we're going to go back to the back here. Thank you. Just as we saw the shuttle, I'm going to go around on the other side here. Just as we saw the crouching of the F-14 Tomcat, this took off of carriers a different way because it had these hooks underneath the airframe here, right under the wheel well. These hooks, there's one on the other side too. There'd be a cable called a bridle, which would go down to the track in the deck of the aircraft carrier where the catapult shuttle was, and then the catapult shuttle would launch it off the deck. Again, going from about 0 to 130 knots in 2 seconds. And that is how it took off. And then that bridle would fall off the front of the deck of the carrier. And so that is how they flew this. This also, it's got a fairing on it, but you can see that you have the fairing on it. But this, they actually had, they also had 20 millimeter machine guns on this as well, but they only carried about 200 rounds, so there wasn't a lot that they could do with it. They figured they were there to drop bombs on targets. It wasn't necessarily an air-to-air fighter, but it's certainly dynamic. If you remember the Falkland War in the Falkland Islands back in the 80s, the Argentinian Air Force flew these, and they successfully sank a couple of British warships, but they succumbed very quickly to the Harrier jets, the jump jets that were flown off the British aircraft carriers, which shot these aircraft down with Sidewinder missiles. So the Sidewinder missile is a very, very formidable enemy. You don't want to get in front of those. If you do, sometimes you have chaff or flares that can fool them. But for the most part, a very quick dogfight in modern times. So this is the military version of the Saber Liner. It's called the Saber Liner because this is the T-39. T stands for trainer. And this was the first business jet. And it was developed by North American, who created the first real combat active US fighter that was a swept wing jet, and that was the Saber Jet, also known as the Saber. And that was our Korean War fighter, and it used to fight against the MiG-15. And inside the hangar, we'll go to see the MiG-15, which was the Soviet version flown by the North Koreans and the Chinese and the Russians back in the 1950s. And then later on, companies like Learjet and Cessna, with a citation, went and created their own business jets. But this was the very first business jet, and you can recognize it on a ramp very easily because it has triangle-shaped windows. This is one of the oldest aircraft in our collection. This is from 1945. This is the Short Solent Mark III. This is the only Mark III short solent in existence that's put together. This is originally going to be a submarine bomber in 1945, but the war ended too soon. So British Airways bought this from the RAF and converted it into a 34-passenger flying boat. It's a flying boat. It's it's like a boat with wings. And so you can see that this gear here is called a beaching gear. This is not a landing gear. They would actually have to float this out to the aircraft on cork. And then they would be able to fly it, would be able to roll it up on the beach if they had to. It's got 4 engines, 4 Hercules engines. It flew about 10,000 feet. And this was, it flew on a route from London down to the bottom of South Africa, so Johannesburg, London to Johannesburg, in a 4.5-day flight, and would land on the water along the way, and people would spend the night at a hotel off the water, and then a boat comes up and picks them up out of the door, and then takes them to shore. And so this was later sold to South Pacific Airlines to fly from Hawaii to Tahiti and to Fiji. And then that route was replaced in the mid-1950s by the 707 jetliner, because we used to have a lot more flying boats. But after the war, we had a lot of Air Force runways. And the United States basically paved over every island on the way to Japan in the Pacific. And so that enabled jetliners that were more efficient, like the 707, to carry passengers. And so that spelled the end of flying boat beauties like this, which were slow, carried few passengers, and had to fly at low altitude and subject to weather and delays. So this is why you don't see a lot of flying boats today. This here, as mentioned earlier, this is the Hawker Siddeley jump jet. This is the T88A, which was and what makes it a jump jet and what makes it unique is that it is a vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. So you see these, instead of jet nozzles that come out the back, these nozzles, actually, it has one jet engine and 4 nozzles, 2 on each side. And the nozzles on the side can port downward in order to direct the jet blast down, and the aircraft can then lift up and hover. And then once it's hovering, those nozzles can turn 90 degrees to the back, and it goes forward. And it can fly transonic, can fly almost to the speed of sound, one pilot. And that is the very popular Marine and British Navy and Air Force aircraft, because again, it doesn't need a runway. It can do takeoffs and landings from a very small deck or from just a very small field. This is the MiG-15. This is the counterpart to the US Saber Jet. What's interesting about the wing on this aircraft is that this barber pole, this is how the pilot would be able to see that the landing gear was down and locked. He didn't have an instrument in the cockpit to say that. And here we go. So this is a very rare look inside the cockpit of a MiG-15. And this aircraft is actually airworthy. So you can see it had an ejection seat as well. There is the throttle on the left, of course the control stick, and then the rudders at the bottom. And of course, this is an old aircraft, so it's got no glass cockpit. It's all steam gauges. So this is the cockpit of the F-15, of the MiG-15. It had a 27 millimeter and a 37 millimeter cannon. This is the intake, providing air to the engine. And this is the Naval Aviation Room here at the Oakland Aviation Museum. This is a scale model of the USS Cabot, or Cabot. I'm not quite sure how it was pronounced. You can see on the deck all of the, look like Hellcats getting ready to take off. And then you've probably got some SBD Dauntlesses in the back, or maybe they're Avengers. I can't tell right off the top. I think they're Dauntlesses, torpedo bombers, and these were U.S. Navy fighters in World War II. The Hellcat was an amazing aircraft, and you can see the stripe in the deck right there. That is actually, this is where the catapult would be, and even back in World War II, they would catapult aircraft off of the decks of aircraft carrier just to get them airborne in a hurry, because you had to get up a lot of speed in order to take off, and you couldn't always count on a nice headwind. Then this is the African Americans in Aviation exhibit at the museum, and it features the Red Tails, the 332nd Airborne Division of this is the all-black Tuskegee Airmen, and they flew primarily older versions of the P-51 B and C, and they escorted bombers, and they had a very successful track record of escorting bombers, and also, as you can see here, attacking ground targets. There's Lieutenant General Benjamin O. Davis, who was one of the 5 original Tuskegee Airmen. Behind us, this is a wall dedicated to one of my personal heroes, Betsy Coleman. Betsy Coleman, back 100 years ago, was the first African American woman and the first African American woman to earn an international pilot's license. And she did it because no one in the U.S. would teach her how to fly, and so she taught herself French, went to France, and was trained in France how to fly, and then came back to the United States and became a barnstormer. And she, for a brief time, tried to open up a flight school here in Oakland, which is why the drive into the Oakland International Airport is named Betsy Coleman Boulevard, because we made sure that she was recognized historically, honoring her and her roots in Oakland Aviation. So this is Betsy Coleman. These are more modern aircraft. This is a Glass Air, which is you can either build these yourself, or you can pay more and have the factory build them. It's a great, really fun aircraft to fly. This is actually, it flies so fast and it's so efficient that it even has to have a speed brake on it, and that pops up since the stream to slow it down. This is the World War II Doodle Aviation exhibit. This shows the original Hornet, where shortly after Pearl Harbor, just a few months after Pearl Harbor, we wanted to reach out and bomb the Japanese. And to do that, General Doodle said, we can lighten up these B-25 bombers and fill them all with fuel and a small crew, and then fly straight to Japan, to Tokyo, for 30 seconds, drop our bombs, and then fly on to China, where hopefully we'll be able to land and be rescued. And some of them made it. Many of them didn't. I think it's 12 of them were captured, and then more were killed. But it was kind of an amazing thing to be able to, and Jimmy Doolittle, who's Doodle Drive, where the museum is located next to, in Alameda here at the Oakland Airport, was named after General Doolittle. And he was in the first aircraft here seen taking off to bomb the Japanese. There's a great movie about this back in the 40s called 30 Seconds Over the Tokyo. And it didn't cause a lot of damage to the Japanese, but it let the Japanese know that we could reach out and touch them, which was an important psychological thing for especially the Americans, to be able to show that, for morale, because it happened so soon after Pearl Harbor. And there was a long time during World War II when there was a great bit of doubt as to whether the United States would be able to win the war. And this here is one piece of technology that set American bombing apart from others. This is the Norden bomb sight. Norden bomb sight sat in the front of American bombers for daylight bombing, and it was a precision bombing device that used basically a primitive onboard computer that would be able to calculate wind speed, ground speed, airspeed, magnetic compass direction, and drift, and be able to calculate that to put a crosshair on a target that when you drop the bomb would land, because bombs just drop straight down, they drift, and they're subject to wind directions at different altitudes. And so this would calculate that and be able to take that into mind. And so the bombardier will be able to do much more accurately than simply just opening the bomb bay and letting them fall out. In fact, it was such secret information that when a bomber crashed, the bombardier had to take out his service revolver and destroy the Norden bomb site so that it didn't fall into enemy hands. And finally, we're going to take a look at the engine room. So these are where the power plants were for the aircraft. This big one here, this is the jet engine that powered the F-14a Tomcat. And this whole half here is the afterburner that would dump raw fuel into the exhaust, and then that would create the afterburner thrust necessary in order to go supersonic. This was the most popular engine in World War II American aircraft for the Navy. It's because it's air-cooled. This is the Pratt & Whitney R2800. And this was on all sorts of aircraft, including the Corsair, the Hellcat, the Bearcat, and the P-47. So with that, I would like to say thank you very much for joining us here at the Oakland Aviation Museum. I'm your docent, Dan. We're open 5 days a week. Come see us Wednesday through Sunday. It's fun for the whole family. Hope we see you here. So thank you very much. Again, I'm docent Dan from the Oakland Aviation Museum. Check us out at oaklandaviationmuseum.org. That's oaklandaviationmuseum.org. Thanks for joining us.